I'm delighted to be here, speaking after Dr. Olabu, who was given a very enlightening presentation. Myself, I don't have slides, but I'll give the legal perspective. I was looking forward to questions, so I'll try to go as quickly as possible, and I'll try to connect with what you have just heard. When you go to law school, and maybe by a show of hands, how many here are lawyers? In other words, you've gone to law school. So there are few. So when you go to law school, one of the things you learn in either first year or second year of law school is what we call criminology, or the study of crime from a social perspective. And we also study about criminal law, which is what behavior or what actions does the society choose to treat as criminal. I have taught criminal law and criminology to law students at some point in time. And when we study criminology, we actually encounter terms or ideas that are very similar to what you encounter when you study morality. Morality is about the rightness or the wrongness of human acts. In fact, the whole scriptures, the whole Bible is put together mainly to help us understand what is morally right and what is morally wrong. The narratives in the Bible are meant to help us to understand that a certain action was harmful to the community and harmful to the person, and therefore was a wrong action. And if you go back to the book of Genesis, you remember the first crime or the first sin that is discussed in Genesis is the sin of Adam and Eve. And Genesis puts it in a very interesting or enticing narrative form. Eve was walking around in the garden. They had been given one commandment only. Do not eat of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. So she saw this very nice fruit. Let's call it an apple, because apples look very nice. And many scholars like using apples as the fruit that Adam and Eve saw. So she saw this apple, and it looked enticing. It looked more enticing than the fruits of all the other trees in the garden. And she wondered, why did God stop us from eating the fruit of the most enticing tree in the garden? He told us we could eat all the other fruits, but there was a catch. This was the most enticing. And so she felt a strong attraction for the fruit. And she disregarded the messages or the commandment she had received. Her eyes were encouraging her. Her ears were listening to the words of the serpent. So everything conspired to make her disregard what God told her. And she she stretched her hand. This is part of biology. She was given an arm which she could stretch and reach things. She grabbed the apple, and it came off very smoothly from the tree. And before she knew it, she tasted it. She ran her tongue round the apple before biting into it, and it felt enticing, and it was cool to the touch. So she took the apple, and then she gave her husband, Adam. They ate. That's the first sin that is described in the Bible. You notice from the narrative of morality that they seemed to be doing something very natural that was in accordance with the human organism. That, in fact, they had a digestive system that could digest the apple very well. But somehow, the consequences of what they did were out of proportion to what they thought was just a simple natural act. In fact, it caused a significant transformation in their society, in their world, in the world that existed until that time. And the phrase that is used in the Bible was that they knew good and evil. So they were told, this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you eat of it, you shall surely die. So that the essence of morality is to determine that there are certain actions that we can do. They are called to, you could say, our human organism. We have the capacity to do them. But the consequences of engaging in these actions is out of proportion to what we might have imagined. Instead of making us happier or more in conformity with the world around us, they cause death and destruction. That was the first sin in the book of Genesis. And you see, it's a narrative to help us understand the concept of morality. And I'll just mention the second one, and then I'll go to the legal side of criminology. So the second sin described in Genesis, and they are coming in very quick succession, these sins. Great things are happening, and together with the great things, unfortunately, man and woman are messing up the world around them. The second sin is the one of Cain. Cain and Abel. So after they've been thrown out from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, there's that whole account where they are thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Then Genesis says, Adam knew his wife Eve. In fact, they like using those nice statements. He knew his wife Eve, and she bore him a son. And then she bore him a second son. So there was Cain and Abel. And there is a story of Abel offering to God after he's grown up and he's become a farmer. No, he's become a farmer and a shepherd. And he offers to God one of his very nice fruit of his flock, probably one of his best lambs. And the smoke went up to heaven. So Cain decided to do the same thing. Cain was also a farmer, probably an agriculturalist, and his offering did not go to heaven. So out of envy, he kills his brother Abel. And again, God is walking around, and he starts calling, Cain, Cain. So Cain answers Yahweh, and Yahweh asks him, where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he is. He's already getting guilty. He knew he should not take the life of his brother. But what had happened is that he had felt a strong fit of envy or jealousy. He had felt such anger at Abel. All the frustrations he had in his life with Abel came to his mind at that one moment. He could not restrain himself. He killed his brother Abel. So what the Bible is trying to articulate to us morally is that sometimes you may feel an inclination to something. You may feel an inclination to stretch out your arm and grab the apple, which is enticing, looks good. You may feel an inclination to kill your brother, to use violence against your brother. But if you follow that inclination, it's going to cause chaos, disaster, collapse of the society. And in morality, we understand that sin has 3 consequences. Every sin has a consequence to the person who commits the sin. It damages you internally. So when Adam and Eve, and this narrative comes out very well in the Bible, in Genesis, when Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, the first thing they see is that each other is naked. We are naked. So the sin affects them. In other words, it unleashes the passion of lust. It changes them from a situation where everything was well ordered to a situation of disorder. The first consequence of sin is it affects you. The first consequence of the sin of Cain is that it affected him. Everyone around him now was at threat because Cain might feel another surge of anger and he might go for someone else. He might kill someone else. So there was a threat. Something changed in Cain. Something changed in Adam and Eve when they sinned. That's the first consequence. It's internal to you yourself. The second consequence of sin, when you do this thing that goes against your innate nature, is that it affects your relationship with society. Adam looked at Eve and she was naked. And Eve looked at Adam and Adam was naked. They had to cover themselves. When Cain killed Abel, there was this threat in his interactions with the rest of the people. And that's why God had to save Cain, in addition to everything else, banish him from the community in which he was living. He was a threat to everyone. That's the second consequence. So the first is personal, the second is social, and the third is spiritual. The relationship of Adam and Eve with God was shattered the moment they ate that fruit. It was shattered. And because the Bible wants us to understand in narrative form, there was a shattering of that relationship. The story is that they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which signifies the shattering of their relationship with God. In the case of Cain, he was deported from the land in which he had grown up, and he was given a mark on his forehead, the mark of Cain, because not only does your relationship with God shatter, your relationship with the other people is affected. And so Cain complains to God that if you'll take me out there, they will kill me. They'll come for me out of fear of what I might do to them. So the mark of Cain is both a brand that you could say signifies his sin and a mark of protection, so that when he's taken out there, at least he's not killed immediately. This is an interesting thing. So the same thing that happens in the moral realm, when you understand it, to human action or behavior that is wrong, is that first of all you notice there is an enticement that seems to be based on nature. Based on nature. Secondly, there is an attraction that is based on the environment. The environment. You saw the apple. Your brother, you saw the smoke going up and you got upset. So there's an environmental cause. There's also a cause that is, you could say, biological. There's a biological cause. There's an environmental cause. But at the end of the day, and this is the heart of morality and the heart of religion, we understand that beyond the biological inclination that may be there, beyond the environmental enticement that may be there, there is a third factor, critical factor, that determines whether you will eat the apple, whether you will murder your brother, and all the litany of sins narrated in the Bible from Genesis until the last book of the Bible, Revelation. All of those have those two elements and a third defining or determining element. This element in religion and morality is called free will, choice. And it is the choice, the decision to eat the fruit, the decision to kill Abel that makes a human action good or bad. Not the nature or biology, not the environment or the nurture, but the human action. And so the interesting thing is that the whole of morality is founded on the idea that the choice to behave in a particular way is something that is not determined by our nature or our nurture, but is something we have the ability to determine for ourselves. That's why it's called free will. That's the essence of sin. So as a lawyer, I always explain to my students that the whole idea of criminology or criminal law is founded on that very same idea. If you commit robbery, you steal some money. The other day, there are some guys who walked into a bank. You remember the story? Hot news. And they stole some money. How much was it? 72 million shillings. And then they were arrested yesterday. 2 of them. Unfortunately, they only had 7 million with them. I've been wondering where the rest of the money went. So, if these 2 people could demonstrate when they are taken to court that they were under such a strong compulsion to steal the money, they were sleepwalking into the bank, and somehow they took the money and they had no ability to say no, do you know they will not be convicted in court? That the fact that you did not have free will is considered a legitimate defense to any criminal charge. The fact that you did it by compulsion, you didn't have the choice, it was not your behavior. Fortunately, we know how to determine whether something was based on your behavior. So for example, it is a complex action. You sat down and you planned how you are going to get into the bank, everything you are going to do, the gun you are going to carry. So there was clearly complexity, there was planning. You used your mind, you used your will, you used different stratagems. It's clear it was not compelled action. So if you use that defense, you will not succeed. The same thing happens sometimes with what are called crimes of passion. You've heard of crimes of passion or hot-blooded crimes. The best example of hot-blooded crime in law is a case where you have a couple, a man and a woman, and one of them, unfortunately in history it tends to be the man, finds his wife in bed with another man. In law, it is called in flagrante delicto. In other words, you found them in the act, in flagrante delicto, in the course of that action of infidelity. So then the man thinks about all the time he spent with this woman. She's betrayed him, and out of anger, without thinking, he has a gun. He takes the gun and he shoots either his wife or that other man. That is called a crime of passion. There are many examples. That's just one. So if you are charged in court with the crime of murder because of something that happened after provocation, the term used is provocation. You are severely provoked. You know, Cain could say he was provoked by Abel. Abel, why are you offering your gifts? And mine are going down, yours are going up, the smoke. So if you can prove provocation, the court, and this is the way all legal systems in Kenya, United States of America, United Kingdom, Germany, France, all over the world, we have the same concept. This is in law. It is universal. If you can prove provocation, then instead of being convicted of first-degree murder, or what in Kenya we call the crime of murder, you'll be convicted of a lesser crime that is called manslaughter. Because the court will be saying that, yes, you still had free will. Don't lie to us that you became a robot. You still had free will. But we understand that provocation made you not think very much before you did what you did. So you acted without reflection. And because of that one, we will convict you of a lesser crime called manslaughter. So the whole idea of law is you must check human behavior. What drove somebody to do this? Was it nature, nurture? Was it free will? And normally, the sociologists, the psychologists say that most human behavior has a mix of nature, of nurture, and of free will. But you will not be convicted because of the nature and the nurture, only because of the free will. And so, I want to very quickly refer to 2 or 3 passages in the Bible that talk about free will in regard to matters of sex or sexuality. And then I will now conclude by explaining the position of the law of Kenya regarding homosexuality. I'll first take you to Matthew chapter 19, because this is the most powerful passage in the New Testament that gives the theology of sex, sexuality, and marriage. And Matthew chapter 19 starts as follows. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea, to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever?" If you are fed up of your wife, if you are fed up with your husband, can you divorce them? You can no longer stomach them. You see them and you just get angry. You feel you might kill this person. Can you just divorce them? And then Jesus answers as follows. "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female?" So Jesus is doing biblical studies. This is a Bible study class he's having with his disciples. And he's telling them, haven't you read in the book of Genesis that he made them male and female at the beginning? In other words, he talks about nature. And then he talks about the reason. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So there is a natural situation. Jesus gives the explanation. They are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. In other words, sex exists for a reason. And the reason of sex, both as an act and as an identity, you heard what Dr. said about gender expression, gender identity. So the reason for sex, the action of sex, the identity that is associated with sex, the action, is so that the two, a man and a woman, become one flesh. So Jesus is talking about procreation, about the act of procreation and everything that goes around it, which is basically the family. And so the Pharisees were very disappointed with this explanation, or they didn't understand it, so they asked a follow-up question. Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? So if you are telling us this, Jesus, then why did Moses allow us to divorce our wives? And Jesus said,
Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Because your hearts were not ready to receive the scripture. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for adultery and marries another woman commits adultery. And it says except for adultery, except for sexual immorality. There are different theological explanations for this exception. I'll not go into them. What I'm trying to say is that Jesus takes the Pharisees back to the beginning. He recognizes that there was a hardness of their heart that caused the law to be changed a bit in the past. But because of the grace of Christ that has come, the grace of God that has come through Christ in the New Testament or the New Covenant, he tells them, we have to go back. We have to reset. We have to go back to factory settings. We have to go back to factory settings. So you notice that Jesus is basically saying that even if you are hard-hearted, you feel like divorcing your wife or husband, please stay together because this is God's will for you. This is what will unite you with God, unite you with your neighbor, and harmonize your own life. This is what will harmonize all these three things. Even if it seems difficult. You've heard, they say that African men, I've heard this statement, African men cannot be faithful to one woman. You've heard this one. This is basically saying that there's a hardness of heart. It makes it difficult for African men. But Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, do you think that he's addressing all other people apart from African men? Are African men part of the audience being addressed in Matthew chapter 19? I can't hear. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that even before we think of LGBT, even in other sexual behavior of those people who consider themselves heterosexual, straight, or whatever other term, is still challenging. You still have to restrain certain urges or inclinations, whether you are a man or a woman. Are we together? So now, after that first passage, I'll go to the second passage. And this one, I will take it from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. 1 Corinthians. This is St. Paul. St. Paul is now teaching. And he's telling the people of Corinth. The people of Corinth had many problems. They had many challenges. And one of them is they were still trying to reconcile the good news of Christ that they had received with their old way of doing things, or the old man. So St. Paul is very firm. He tells them, do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And that is what some of you were. But you are washed, you are sanctified, you are justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. The version I'm reading of 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9 to 11, instead of using the word homosexual, it uses the words men who have sex with men. And the reason is because when we say homosexuals, there is confusion. Are we referring to identity, orientation, or behavior? You remember very early on, I told you that what morality or religion is concerned about is human acts or behavior. It's not concerned about the way you look, whether you are black or white, green or yellow. He's not concerned whether you are tall or short. He's not even concerned whether you are male or female. The morality of Christ, or the morality even of Judaism, is a morality that is universal to all human beings, dependent on what you do, not who you are or you think you are. The same thing with law. Law doesn't punish you because of your sex. That would be sex discrimination. Because of your race, that would be race discrimination. Or even because of your sexual attraction or orientation. The fact that you might be a man who feels attracted to other men sexually, or a woman who feels attracted to other women sexually, cannot be a crime. The same way, when Eve was attracted by the apple, that was not a crime. What was the sin? The sin was stretching out her hand, her arm, taking the apple. I don't think she had still committed the sin. She was now dialoguing with temptation. So it was the preliminary stage. Until the moment she sank her teeth into the apple, there was still hope for humanity. In the same way, when Cain grabbed, I don't know what he used. Was it a sharp rock? I don't remember whether the Bible tells us what Cain used to kill Abel. But when he grabbed the tool, when he went and he looked for Abel, when he came out and he started trying to sweet-talk him, as his rage was growing, there was still hope for Cain and for humanity. But when he finally decided to do it, before he even hit Abel with that sharp rock or whatever it is he used, that's when he had committed the sin. So temptation or inclination is not a sin, neither can it be considered a crime. Even Jesus, we read in the New Testament, was tempted 3 times. And yet Jesus is the sinless one. So temptation is not the same as sin. So that second passage is very important because I think it helps to clarify what is sin and what is not sin. So what is the sin? St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, is despite or yielding to the temptation to engage in sexual relations with a person of the same sex, or even adultery. You notice for St. Paul, he doesn't distinguish whether you are an adulterer or homosexual. You're all not going to get to the kingdom of heaven unless you repent. These people are not going to heaven. So what the Bible is saying is, and this is a moral code, is that there's certain action that you may feel attracted to, but unless you hold yourself back, it will not take you to heaven. In medicine, there is a certain condition called kleptomania. It's a psychological or psychiatric condition of people who have a strong impulse to steal. They are called kleptomaniacs. Some of them might even be very well off, men and women. They go to a supermarket. Maybe you reach there driving a very big car. But when you're in the supermarket, you feel a strong urge to take something and hide it in your purse or in your bag without paying for it. That's kleptomania. So if you're a kleptomaniac and you steal some lipstick in the supermarket, is it a crime? Is it a crime? Is it a sin? Why? Because the kleptomania does not compel you to do it. It just means you have to struggle a bit more not to steal than the average person, but you are still called upon to respect the property of others. If you are an alcoholic, you may find it so easy to take alcohol and get drunk, drunkenness is a sin, and another person might not feel any attraction to alcohol. But if you get drunk, the fact that you're an alcoholic or you are not, is it a sin? So it doesn't matter what was your inclination. What matters is, did you have the choice to do it or not? And in doing that action, does it harm you or it doesn't? So we can see that sexual immorality includes many sins, and all of them are a problem. So now I want to go and to look at one last passage. I hope I get it. And my time is up. I've been told 5 minutes to go. So there is hope. There is hope for us. So the last passage which I'm struggling to get is from Genesis. Let's see whether... Yes, I've got it. Genesis chapter 19. This passage, I think, more than any other, explains if homosexuality is a sin, adultery is a sin. Why is it that adultery is not a crime, homosexuality is considered a crime? You understand that both are sins, but in the law of the land, if you engage in adultery, can you be taken to prison? There is no crime in our penal code called adultery, but there is a crime called homosexuality. So the question is, if there are sins, that is religion. Now me, I want to talk as a lawyer. Why is it that in our law, we consider homosexuality as so serious that it is not like another sin? Like if you lie, if you don't go to church on Sunday, you may have committed a sin, but it's not a crime. So crimes normally are meant to be certain kinds of disordered human behavior that has a substantial impact on society, either directly or indirectly, is likely to lead to serious impact on society. So Genesis chapter 19 is a fascinating passage. And this is the story of Lot and Sodom. So what happened is that Yahweh went and spoke with Abraham in verse 18, in chapter 18. And they were talking about whether Sodom and Gomorrah should be saved. And you remember that fantastic dialogue they have between Abraham and the Lord. Will you destroy this place if there are 50 men, 50 just men in that town? And God says, I'll not do it if there are 50. And Abraham asked him, what if there are 10 less than the 50? There are only 40. Will you destroy the town? I'll not do it for the sake of 40. What if there are 30? What if there are 20? Eventually, Abraham says, I know I'm going beyond where I should, but one last time, I ask you, Lord, what if there are only 10 men? I'll not do it for the sake of 10. But because there were no 10 just men in Sodom, the two angels were sent. And Genesis 19 starts with the two angels coming to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. You know, when angels take human form, because angels are not human beings, they don't have human form. When they take human form, they can look very handsome. And indeed, these two angels were quite handsome, I assume, when they reached Lot. He rose to meet them. He bowed himself with his face to the earth, and he said, my lords, turn aside, I pray to you, to your servant's house, and spend the night, and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. They used to wear sandals. So these two angels were wearing sandals. Their feet were dusty. And so they went into his house. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? They saw them coming in. And this is what the sin of homosexuality does.
I don't have much time because I now have maybe 2 minutes to finish. So I cannot explain as long as I wanted to, but it is a particularly aggressive sexual sin. What is the difference between homosexuality and adultery? You don't have any other sin where you have Gay Pride Month, where you try to change the law, you try to change church, you try to change education, you try to change the family, you try to change society. This is what homosexuality does to society. It is particularly violent. It must subject every other institution of society to itself. So this story in Genesis 19 it's a narrative. It's a narrative that is an analogy of what homosexuality does. So they were so interested in the two men, they said, bring them out to us that we may know them. You remember, we spoke about knowledge in the biblical sense. They didn't mean they would have a symposium with the two men. No. By knowing them means they wanted to engage in gang rape, sodomitical gang rape. So Lot got really in panic because in the Semitic world, one of the most important qualities of society was hospitality. You could not have anything wrong happen to your visitor. So what he did is shocking to us, what Lot did. He said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known man. They were virgins, his own daughters. What did he say? Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. It's shocking to us. Lot was ready to offer his daughters to be gang raped so that he could save the men. But this narrative is very important, even though none of us should ever tolerate the idea of doing what Lot did. But that was his offer. It's not me, it's the Bible. So what did they say? They said, stand back. Stand back. This fellow came to sojourn and he would play the judge. In other words, Lot himself was not indigenous in Sodom. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the door. The angel saved Lot because they struck the men with blindness, closed the door. That's how they saved Lot. And they left early in the morning on the next day, and fire and brimstone consumed Sodom. This is an analogy. It's a narrative. It's a historic tale, but it has a lesson for us today. And this is the very reason why our law prohibits homosexual behavior. Even if it may tolerate adultery, well, we know adultery is wrong, in the case of homosexuality, there is that understanding that this homosexual behavior doesn't just remain between the 2 men or the 2 women who close the door in private to do their deed. And like what John Stuart Mill said, he's a philosopher. What happens to homosexuality is that the deed, regardless of the disposition of the men or women who engage in it, is virulent. It is like a cancer. It seeks to subjugate society. And that is why in the Western world, in religion, churches, you cannot preach against homosexuality. The passages I read to you will be a problem reading them in some Western countries. In education, your children have to learn both about homosexual and heterosexual and given a choice to decide for themselves. If it is in adoption agencies have to be ready to give the children to a homosexual or heterosexual couple. If it is people have decided to a feeling, because you know sometimes you have deep-seated attraction to a person of the same sex. If you are in the Western world, you are not allowed to cancel them so that they can live a normal lifestyle, avoid their homosexual behavior, and try to live even
set up a family in the normal heterosexual sense. It's considered a crime. It's considered wrong. This is what the gay lobby, which goes beyond the person who may be engaged in gay behavior, leads to. It leads to subjecting the entire society. The same way, the moment homosexuality spread in Sodom, there were not even 10 men, 10 just men who could be found in that town. And so I want to finish now in my remaining 20 seconds by saying, what should be the attitude in law and what should be the attitude of the Christian to homosexuality? First of all, the attitude of the Christian is the one that is easiest to say. The attitude of the Christian should involve two dimensions. We are all sinners. We are all broken. Whether one person is struggling with homosexuality or struggling with sin of lust or struggling with sin of theft or struggling with laziness or struggling with disorder, we are all broken. We are all sinners. And the blood of Christ was shed for each and every one of us. So our first attitude as Christians to anyone who is suffering from sin is to recognize that we are fellow sinners, journeying towards grace. So our first attitude to anyone in sin, regardless of the sin, is compassion, spiritual accompaniment. You don't throw them out of church. You don't publish their names and say we'll have nothing to do with you if they are struggling against that weakness. Compassion. But at the same time, and this is where the problem generally is, sometimes we assume compassion means you keep quiet about the moral quality of the act. The moment you stop telling the alcoholic that he needs to struggle to stop alcoholism, you are no longer walking with him towards Christ. You may think you are, but if you are still walking with him or her, you are walking in another direction. So, compassion requires of necessity clarity, which means we have to be clear. Yes, it's a sin. I'll work with you so that we can help you to overcome it. But I will not mislead you or lie to you and tell you it's not a sin, it's okay. And that's why the problem of homosexuality, at least as far as church is concerned, is not so much the people who are struggling with homosexuality, is the people who identify, manifest proudly that homosexuality and say, you must treat me as someone who is homosexual. Maybe he's even married to a man or she's married to a woman, and she wants you to say nothing about their homosexual behavior. That means they're asking for compassion without clarity. So what we've said is that in church, the message is simple: clarity and compassion. What about in law? It's more complicated. Because we've seen not every sin is a crime. In a society where the sin spreads so much and you make it a crime, you might have to imprison everyone. So if you go to a country in Europe where homosexuality has spread rampantly, if you make homosexuality a crime, you might have to lock up millions of people or tens of thousands of people. So it's an issue of prudence. What I would say is that if a society is able to keep the vice of homosexuality from spreading through criminal law, then it is better off than the one which cannot. But if it proves impossible because of the situation of the society, then the law has to be adjusted to recognize that this thing has become extremely rampant in society. In America right now, they are struggling with the question of drugs, consuming drugs, selling drugs, because they have hundreds of thousands of men especially, and mainly black men, in prison because of drug crimes. And they're asking themselves, should we remove the crime from the statute books? But they know if they remove the crime, the situation will get worse. So they have decided No, we'll lock them up, because if we don't lock them up, we might end up with 20 million people taking drugs. So the question of whether something should be a crime is more complicated. Thankfully for us in Kenya, we are not at that level where we can even say that we should start thinking about whether homosexuality should be legal. And so I'll finish by saying that I was the lawyer who represented Kenya Christian Professionals Forum in a case in the High Court in Kenya, which was brought by those who wanted to get a constitutional interpretation that Section 162 of the Penal Code that makes homosexuality in Kenya a